I'm now going to hand over to Sam Majic, who is an associate professor of political science at John Jay College, CUNY, and who will introduce us to and chair a panel of second-generation FI scholars.
There are 3 questions to go through. So the first question is the reasons that everybody was drawn to feminist institutionalism. And so in talking about this, I think it would be helpful when we hear from all of you, if you could talk about what your research area is generally and why you were drawn to feminist institutionalism. So Cecilia, would you want to start?
So I work in the field of gender and politics, and I initially started doing research on gender quotas. And sort of working within the field of gender and politics and being interested in how institutions, and in this case, a formal institution like a gender quota, structure and sort of gender political life, I think feminist institutionalism has provided me with sort of an important lens to see these sort of developments too. So that's been important. And also, the fact that I have more senior colleagues in my department, like Elin Bjarnegård and Josefina Eriksson, I've seen them sort of being part of developing feminist institutionalism and also use it in their work in a very fruitful way. That has, of course, sort of also inspired me in many ways and been sort of very important for me.
Great, thank you. Pedro, did you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, and my research is also on gender quotas in the beginning, so now it has moved in different directions. And I think as I was reflecting on this question, I think it was important to go back in the time period specifically, because I think I was a product of that time, and that was a confluence of things that really made feminist institutionalism really make sense for what I was doing. So this probably happened in 2009, 2010. I was in graduate school at the time in Kansas, and as I was developing my research on women's underrepresentation in Brazil specifically, and why the gender quotas in Brazil were not successful, my graduate coursework was moving me towards new institutionalism, and the formal and informal institutions and all those things. And I was introduced to the beginning, to a certain extent, of the debate on feminist institutionalism in one of my courses, and started realizing that makes sense, right? So, and also at the same time, that was me starting to go to conferences, and then I met Mona Elena Crook and then Jennifer Piscopo and other people that are deep into feminist institutionalism, and so those interactions were very helpful too, right?
Great, thank you. And Jennifer.
Thanks. I guess I'm slightly different in slight contrast to Cecilia and Pedro, in the sense that initially my research was focused less on institutions and more on a particular policy area. So my doctoral thesis was looking at abortion policy, or the absence of abortion policy, perhaps more accurately in the context of Northern Ireland. But feminist institutionalism was helpful to me because I was thinking about that in the context of political decision-making and the absence of political decision-making. So it was very helpful to me to think about the particular institutional context in Northern Ireland and the ways in which that was established and how that acted as a barrier to thinking about gendered policy concerns, such as abortion. I think echoing Cecilia and Pedro as well, I think this is also to do with the particular context and time period in which I was writing my PhD thesis. Obviously, there's been a lot of work in the UK context on feminist institutionalism, and a lot of work at Westminster and in Scotland and Wales, but there had been less work in Northern Ireland. So I think in some ways I was kind of sort of trying to contribute to that conversation around feminist institutionalism across the UK context as a whole as well.
I think what everybody's brought up here is interesting in the sense of the broad context in which this theoretical frame is applicable. So I know 2 of you have talked about looking at it more in the formal legislative sense, in looking at quotas in electoral politics versus in a policy area. And I know in my own work, I came to it I don't even remember how, actually. I think maybe like you, Pedro, I was reading about new institutionalism for a project, and this gender angle was so interesting. But in my own work, actually, I first started using it when I was doing research on sex worker rights activism and sex workers in the nonprofit sector. And so, I took a lot of my data from that project, and I rethought how these nonprofits that were founded by sex worker activists, in fact, operated as gendered institutions that promoted very highly politicized and often politically complicated and challenging ideas about sex worker rights, even as they were funded by government agencies that had particularly gendered and negatively gendered practices against people in the sex industry. So I think what's been really interesting here is just all the different ways in which we've variously engaged with this area of research. I was wondering now if we could move then to talk about at least two different ways in which feminist institutionalism has been valuable in your current research. And we can start with Jennifer.
Sure. So thinking about, I guess, two ways kind of combined in one research project. Since my doctoral work, I've been working a lot more in the area of feminist international relations. And recently I've been doing some work with my colleague at the University of Bath, Sophie Whiting, and we've been looking at why anti-gender governments still choose to engage with gender equality measures. So we've been looking at Brazil and Poland, and why Brazil and Poland have still chosen to engage with the United Nations Women, Peace and Security agenda, despite the very pronounced anti-gender discourse of both contemporary governments. And a lot of work on the WPS agenda looks at it from the perspective of the kind of final completed policy product. Okay, it looks at it from the perspective of the national action plans that states produce around that work. And we think in the work we've been doing on this, we think that doesn't help us to explain why the agenda gets picked up in some places and not in others, and why some policy areas are focused on and not on others. So we think that the kind of methodological framework that feminist institutionalism provides is really important. And I think that kind of methodological aspect of FI is perhaps not seen as being perhaps as important as substantive contributions, but I think it is really important for kind of translating FI to other contexts and for giving us that kind of toolkit for thinking about how we understand the black box of the state, okay, how we understand the inner workings of things happening or not happening.
Great. Pedro.
Yes, and for me, like I always want to try to be careful because I feel like I'm so ingrained in FI that I don't do any work that doesn't approach FI even in my personal life, right? So there's understandings of formal and informal institutions, the concept of gendered logics, right? They continue to influence me, like I think in the scholarship, but also how I teach and in my service in higher education, kind of things I choose to do and how I choose to approach those things are kind of embedded in this conversation of gender as an institution, right? So even in some of publications that I don't use feminist institutionalism explicitly, this gender logics are still there, right? This gender understanding of gender institutions is still there. So I know for me, like, FI, that is the one value is that it has really helped me center how I think about institutions, right? Currently one of my research projects is seeking to better understand the intersection of populism and masculinity. And again, there's insights of gender as an institution and the formal and informal rules and communication, especially. It's something that definitely moving in a different direction. So, most of my research has been in the current moment. Also, being a scholar of Brazilian politics, especially, the current moment also requires us to think about masculinity. But it's important to remember that masculinity is in this context of gender logics and gendered actors. So think about Bolsonaro specifically and his own like hyper masculine persona, or Donald Trump in the United States and his hyper masculine persona. How can we think about this from this context of feminist institutionalism is important. So yeah, so to me, like it's more than just a theoretical and methodological approach. It becomes really how a lens to see the world, a gender lens to see the world That really helps me. And I honestly also I think as a cis man, that also helps me, challenge even my own subconscious understandings of how the world works.
I feel, Pedro, just to say quickly, I feel like this is like when I teach my gender and politics class, and once the students, see what gender means, they can't unsee it anymore. Cecilia.
Yes, thank you. So I think in my current book project, I explore resistance to gender equality policy and women's political inclusion. And I do that by studying resistance to a gender quota policy in Uruguay. And I think that in this project, feminist institutionalism has sort of provided me with a framework or a way to sort of see the world that has helped me a whole lot of theorizing actors' sort of institutional room of maneuver and how that room of maneuver differs for men and women in this particular context. And it also sort of highlights how men, or allows me to highlight how men strategically use formal and informal institutions to keep women out of politics and stop quota adoption and implementation in Uruguay. So in that project, it's really been sort of key in getting this, in highlighting these sort of dynamics. In another project, it has also been sort of super important. And this is the work I do with Josefina Eriksson about the gendered working environment in the Swedish parliament. And here I think FI has been of great help as that we have explored informal and very subtle gender inequalities in this sort of super gender equal parliament. But sort of despite being very subtle and despite being informal, we're able to show that this has great implications for men and women's possibilities to legislate on equal terms.
That's amazing. I'm just thinking of my own work, and I feel like I've moved into my more recent work is on celebrities and politics, actually. And so, gender has been all over this topic. But I've been focused, I guess, less on institutions and more on individual actors. But at the same time, I feel like, since I started engaging with feminist institutionalism probably over a decade ago now, it's really solved a lot of problems in my graduate student advising. And so I have I supervise a lot of students in the criminal justice doctoral program. And I can think of, one student right now, Lauren Moten, who is doing a project on human trafficking, what are called human trafficking intervention courts. And these are, populated mostly by defendants who are cis and trans women sex workers. And so, it's really been just this easy way to say to her, here are all the things you need to look for now in your research, and this will help you think about how these courts operate. And especially, with a lot of the students in a criminal justice context, it's really been invaluable in my advising work. I was wondering then maybe we should shift to talk about the gaps in feminist institutionalism, or even, things to build on more. And two things have already come up in this conversation. One is feminist institutionalism as method, I think is something that could be expanded well in the social sciences. And then Pedro, you said something really interesting about feminist institutionalism within our own university service, which we know is such a highly gendered phenomenon, with women, tending to do more kinds of service than men, and the different ways in which masculinity and femininity tend to play out in university service as well. So I'll open it up to anybody.
I guess I can start. And Sam, I think you mentioned your students, and the one direction I think, and we're seeing some research, I think it's a good example of that, is this intentional inclusion of intersectionality within feminist institutionalism, right? This is a good approach to delve into concepts that go beyond gender. So gender and race, gender identities, and all those, and then this different concept, class as well, right? But there also may be limitations, because if we're trying to explain too many things, we may be losing a little bit of parsimony over there, and that can be complicated when we're trying to do social science research, right? But I think we're seeing this a lot in research about minorities, more broadly speaking, right? We're seeing this move towards intersectionality that has, very important and interesting theoretical and methodological consequences, right? So I think FI could be a good tool to move that direction, to move to intersection identities, into intersection discussions, and how institutions operate intersectionally.
That's great. Others?
I would just kind of echoing sort of what I was saying earlier, but I think it would be really exciting to see FI taken up more within feminist international relations. I don't think it's really used that much yet, but I think there's a lot of scope to do feminist institutionalist work within feminist international relations. I think a lot of the key substantive concerns within feminist IR are very much concerns that center around institutions. Even just, the military, for example, right? There's a plethora of work on the military within feminist IR, and thinking about that from the perspective of FI, I think would be really interesting and would provide a lot of new insights. But just also echoing what Pedro said earlier as well, like as you were talking, I was realizing that yes, I also think about feminist institutional ideas a lot when I'm thinking about my own academic institution, and particularly when I'm thinking about equality and diversity measures within my own academic institution. So I wonder if perhaps this is too navel-gazing, but perhaps there should be some FI work specifically on the academy as a gendered institution.
Cecilia?
Yeah, no, I just like this point about intersectionality that really struck me this fall when I supervised a student who was doing work on intersectionality. And she was like, where's the FI literature on intersectionality? And like, I don't know. There is none. So I think that is an important sort of area for more FI engagement. Another thing that I've struggled with sort of in my own work is concerns how to sort of develop analytical tools to make FI more applicable in empirical research. I think it's a great sort of provides a great lens through sort of by which we can sort of perceive the world. But at times I think it's sort of a bit a theory on a higher level that makes it difficult to sort of draw out expectations. So yeah, that is something I have sort of looked for and thought something that I've struggled with when applying an FI framework to my own work.
This point about intersectionality is really interesting because it leads me to think of one area I think feminist institutionalism can grow in, and I think that's an effort to move away from an idea of gender and sex binaries. And I know everybody who does FI, has a very sophisticated and definitely more sophisticated than most people in political science understanding of gender. But I feel like a lot of FI scholarship, and I would include my own in that, tends to talk very much about men, women, masculinity, and femininity. And I wonder, if more engagement with queer theory and ideas of challenging gender binaries and how institutions, may in fact do those things or not do those things might be, I think, a way to engage with a lot of the other critical scholarship in political science in sexuality studies, for example, and widen the community. And then, just with widening the community, I think this is something, and it's not the fault of feminist institutional scholars, but, why can the mainstream institutional scholars not use this or get their head around this? Why is it? And I think, your point, Jennifer, about even feminist IR is kind of siloed from feminist institutionalism is just, it's just really interesting to think, why it has kind of remained in some ways for some people its own separate thing. And I don't know if anyone has thoughts or wants to talk about that.
I completely agree.
Yeah. And at a local level for me, like I actually teach in an institution that it's two separate institutions. One is a men's college and one is a women's college.
Oh.
with a Catholic, Benedictine specifically dynamic. And we're struggling with this right now. We actually move into more integration. And a big part of the struggle is the embedded gender binary that exists, and how we're going to address this in the future, as the demographic of students is changing, right? And this is becoming also more accepted and more, students are coming in with these identities more fully formed, or at least more beyond the binary that we've been seeing. So I see this a lot, at the closer level possible, right? Both with students and how our institutions are trying, to address these issues. Yeah, I agree completely.
I agree with you completely about, frustrations about more mainstream scholarship not taking on board, FI considerations. And I don't think this is an answer, just an observation that I think, it's always been that way with feminist and gender work. FI is not unique in this regard. I think it's quite easy if you work in gender and politics, and that's kind of, your community and your subfield, it's quite easy to forget that there's a whole host of people that exist in the same discipline as you and never think about any of the things that we're thinking about. So it's not just FI, it's gender writ large, unfortunately.
And I think too, this goes back to just our, I guess, social and academic training. Like I know in my institution, when some students take POL 237, which is gender and politics, this is the first time they've ever thought about gender. But also to your point, Pedro, I think a lot of students are coming in definitely with more sophisticated and less binaristic understandings of how gender and sexuality show up in their own lives. And so I feel like there is this openness to it. But if we look at, scholars, let's just say our age, right? We definitely, I know I stumbled on gender studies when I was in college, and I was a political science major, and there was, very little. And so that just carries through your graduate training. And so, I think the fault is kind of with us and our training as well.
Yeah, something that you mentioned, and I think that's part of sometimes a struggle within feminist institutionalism. We are, collectively, we're scholars, and the scholarship we're trying to build is trying to engage with mainstream political science, right? So we're kind of embedding ourselves with new institutionalism and just kind of making the point that gender is an institution and we need to engage that. And that may be also a limitation when trying to engage with critical scholarship, right? Where if we're trying to be mainstream, we may not be able to be methodologically, and theoretically as critical, right? So it is. I feel that there is a tension that some scholars talk about this more directly, but I'm guessing many of us struggle with that too. Like where where do we want to send our research to, and is it too critical? Is it too mainstream? So we're in this middle ground too.
Well, it's great to meet you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for taking the time.